Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from online. Welcome to today's Migration Policy Seminar. If for some reason this is your first seminar with the Migration Policy Center, welcome. The Migration Policy Center conducts advanced research and training on migration, mobility, and asylum. And we are part of the Robert Schuman Center, which is part of the European University. And we are coming to you live online from Florence, Italy. Okay, so today I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Lorenzo Piccoli, who's going to talk to us today about migration representation in the movies from 1940 till now. And so it's not that migration has not appeared in the movies, and it's not that there hasn't been research about it, but it's been fragmented. And so today Lorenzo is going to present a data set of over 400 data entries that work to systemize how migration is depicted in the cinema, with some interesting findings. Dr. Lorenzo Piccoli is a part-time assistant professor. He oversees our executive training together with the School of Transnational Governance. He is currently writing a book, has of course published dozens of articles. His book right now is focused on the dilemmas that volunteers face who work at social service organizations working with migrants. My favorite part, which is not in his bio, is that I'm pretty sure this data set was started or created while Lorenzo was sick on medical leave, but I will let him disclose if that is the case. But that is how passionate he is about creating data sets to understand what is happening in migration. So Lorenzo, over to you. Lorenzo, just as a point of facilitation, Lorenzo will present his findings for 20-ish minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So while he's talking, make sure you're thinking and writing questions. If you're online, you'll also be able to either submit your questions in the chat or come off mute. So the majority of the time afterwards is held for discussion. Okay, now Lorenzo, officially over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephanie, and thank you for joining us online or in person. It's freezing cold in the room, so I'll try to keep this very dynamic, and I hope you will have plenty of questions and comments on this presentation, which is really a side project. I wasn't planning on sharing this, but as Stephanie mentioned, I was stuck in bed for 2 weeks last year. I was terribly bored. I didn't know what to do, so as a very healthy passion, I started to binge watch movies. And then I realized many of those movies were about migration. And that's why this, again, little side project started out of curiosity and boredom. And the starting idea is that we spend a lot of time at the Migration Policy Center trying to understand how people think about migration and trying to understand the stories we tell about migration. And movies are a very important part of that, and surprisingly quite overlooked in the literature. People spend a lot of time looking at media, for example, how media talk about migration. But in my mind, movies are a very powerful way of shaping our way of constructing migration for a few reasons. One reason is that movies are very expensive. It takes a lot more time and resources to produce a movie than it does to produce a newspaper article or a clip on YouTube. And another reason is that some messages of movies tend to really stick in the mind of people. So I think it's worth trying to understand how movies contribute to the ways in which we understand migration. And this is important also because movies about migration, as Stephanie mentioned, there have been hundreds, possibly even thousands of movies that talk about migration. But I think they talk about migration in very different ways. So what I will try to do today is try to uncover some patterns and trends in which movies portray migration. And before I share some very preliminary findings from this project, I wanted to ask for your help in trying to understand better the ways in which movies should be important for a better understanding of migration. And I try to propose 4 different ways in which I think movies are really important for us, assuming that most of the people in this room are interested in migration studies, or in political dynamics more generally. So the first one is that movies and the images that they produce, they shape what we call migration aspirations. So the desire of people to move, to migrate, and to travel abroad. And I think one very powerful example of that is a recent movie that's called Io Capitano that came out a couple of years ago. And the reason why I think it's a powerful example is because many international organizations, for example, IOM, uses the movie in many countries, especially in North Africa, to talk to people about why they desire to travel abroad, to migrate. And they use the movie as a starting point to discuss migration aspirations. In some cases, with the desire to really influence those aspirations. But anyways, I think this shows how movies can be used as a powerful mean to shape the way in which people think about the possibility to migrate in the future. And this was just one example, but again, maybe you will be able to give me more examples in this sense. The second mechanism is that I think movies are very important in influencing general debates we have about migration. And perhaps one very current example of that is a movie that I think won several awards just a couple of nights ago at the Golden Globes, which is called One Battle After Another, which came out a few months ago. And for those who watch the movie, this is a powerful movie also to talk about current immigration rates in the United States. And it has been used extensively to talk about the role, for example, of the Department of Homeland Security in the US again. I think there are many other examples of movies that really play a role in public debates in many different communities. A third mechanism, different one, is I think movies are very important in shaping the identity of diaspora communities. This is probably also important to me as an Italian. There is a long strand of Italian movies representing the Italian diaspora abroad, for example, in Switzerland, where I lived before, but also in the United States. The suggestion I got from Ettore Recchi, who I'm not sure it's watching online, is the movies on The Godfather, which are actually really about migration, Italian migration in the United States, and the integration process of this community. And we can think of many other similar movies for other communities. I'm thinking, for example, the Indian community. There was a movie I saw when I was a kid, which is called Bandit Like Beckham, that is really about the Indian community and diaspora in the United Kingdom. Okay, the fourth mechanism that I identified, and this might be a bit of a stretch, but I think movies are sometimes used as, I call it cultural infrastructure by politicians and policymakers to justify the choices that they take. Just last month, I was listening to an interview by the New York Times with a guy who is very high up, again, in the Department of Homeland Security in the US, who was talking about a movie he watched in the 80s, which is called The Border. And he said that movie was when he started to think about a career in what would then become the Department of Homeland Security in the US and really shaped his vision for his professional tasks. A different example of this is perhaps a movie which is, again, an Italian movie. I'm Italian, obviously, my accent gives it away, which is called Fuoco a Mare, Fire at the Sea, which came out in 2016, I believe, also won a few awards, and was used by many politicians to try and justify their positions on migration in a context when migration was a very, very salient topic in the European Union. I think some Italian politicians also pushed for the movie to be watched at the European Parliament at the time. So I'm not entirely sure about this fourth mechanism, and I'm curious whether you think there are other ways in which movies can be important tools in shaping understandings of migration with some effects. Now, you might think, of course, many other people have worked on this topic before, which is true. But what I noticed is that a lot of the articles and the books I've read are about specific movies and the effects they have in society or the way in which they construct migration, or specific genres. So, for example, more realist movies or movies that are made by migrants themselves. But what I didn't have in these 2 weeks of boredom when I was stuck in bed was a sort of a big picture. So what are all the movies that are being produced about migration? And again, in what ways do they talk about migration? Can we see some general patterns and trends? So this is what I set out to do already last year. And I created a database. I love creating databases. This is still, I have to say, a bit of a sketch in the sense that it doesn't include a lot of variables. But the idea was really to try, again, and cast a very wide net and include in the database the movies that talk about migration as a central theme, and then try to understand in what ways do they talk about migration. And I hope this is really a starting point and the database will grow in the future. You can already access the database online, and I hope I would be very happy if over the next few weeks we'll manage to include this resource on the website of the Migration Policy Center, where we already have many other resources about migration and also individual attitudes towards migration. Just a few information on the database before I present some of the patterns that I found. This database largely draws on the archives of IMDb. That's where I gather information, although at some point last year I also published it online as a way to receive more suggestions from other people. I got hundreds of suggestions, which was amazing. And at the moment in the database, there are about 550 movies. So the goal, again, is to include in the database all the movies that are about migration that came out between 1940 and now, really. And to avoid having this database including thousands of entries, I only include the movies that went out through some official distribution channel, so not the movies that are self-produced. This is the kind of boundary that I draw. And the goal, of course, is to have movies from all over the world. I don't want to restrict the database to a specific geographical area. So before I present some of the very preliminary findings, just one caveat, as we say, obviously the database does not include all the movies about migration, because I'm sure there are many movies on this topic that I haven't been aware of until now. And I still rely on external contributions. So if you notice that there are some important movies that you know about that are not in the database, please write to me and I will be happy to include those movies. But by and large, I'm quite confident of the patterns that I will discuss now, precisely because I already opened up the database to many other people from all over the world. So what do we observe? I have 4 figures to share. So the first figure is on the place where movies take place. This is not the place of production of a movie. This is really where most of the movie takes place. And unsurprisingly for me, but also I think quite remarkably, the large majority of the movies on migration takes place in one country, that is the United States of America. And also, in general, most of the movies about migration take place either in the United States of America or in European countries. There are, of course, some very important movies that are done outside of those areas. But really, most frequently, those are the geographical settings of movies about migration, which is quite striking just because this is not where most of migration happens globally. Now, this is also confirmed by the larger regions where movies take place. And what we see is, again, a strong concentration of movies in Europe and North America, also, I would say, a very strong growth of movies that are about migration, especially in Europe, especially in the last 20 years. Now, this is again confirmed by the language that is spoken in the movie, which tends to be predominantly English, followed by French, Spanish, and Italian. But again, some other very important languages globally, but also in migration dynamics like Mandarin are very, very rare in migration movies. Now, the most important or interesting part of this for me was really try to look at, okay, what type of migration is presented in different movies. And for this, I created 10 different categories that are about different types of migration that we try to make sense at the Migration Policy Center. And once again, if you think there are other themes that it would be important to include in the database, I'm very open to suggestions. And then I tried to code the movies, and then I relied on an external coder, whom I think whose identity I can disclose. It's Luca Bernasconi, who is maybe watching us online, just to check that my coding was actually accurate and it was not completely arbitrary. And we got, as you call it, intercoder reliability of 90%. So for sure, some of the movies we made a different call, but 90% of the choices were in line between me and Luca. So the result is I've experimented with different ways to visualize this, and I think this might be the most effective way. What you see in here is those different themes about migration movies for each decade, from the decade of the 1940s up to today. And I think there are two main takeaways from this visualization. I'm a bit ashamed of calling it a visualization from this figure, really. The first is that there are a few themes that are much more frequent, in general, 5 of them, right? So the theme of border crossing, the moment when people cross a border, either legally or illegally. Forced displacement, there might be refugee experience, but not necessarily. The theme of integration or social inclusion or life in a foreign country, if you want. Undocumented migration, regular migration. And finally, to some extent, also diaspora, and the experience of living abroad and maintaining some connections with the country where you have or where your family had nationality before. Now, those are important themes over time. Over the last 20 years, again, there is a very sharp acceleration in the number of movies that are produced about 3 specific themes: border crossing, forced displacement, and undocumented migration. Today, if you look at the decade of the 2020s, really, most movies are about these 3 themes. Okay. So this is my preliminary analysis. I'm going to jump to the discussion and conclusions. But first, I was playing with artificial intelligence yesterday as I was preparing this presentation, and I gave a prompt to ChatGPT. And the prompt was, give me 10 snapshots of migration-related movies. We can see that there is still some work to be done to improve artificial intelligence because the snapshots produced are actually 12, I think, not 10. But also, I think this confirms the previous slide that you just saw. So a lot of these snapshots, to me, most of them, except for maybe 3 or 4 of them, they represent images that, by the way, are not from movies. They're just made up by artificial intelligence. Images of suffering, images of danger, I'd say images of illegality or crossing borders in ways that are definitely not very regular. And this confirms my impression, looking at this database, that there is, through movies, a spectacularization of migration, and the focus really on stories that are about migration that is irregular or migration that is because of war, forced displacement, migration that is very dramatic, which is, of course, very important. And I hope you will not misread my argument, but my argument is that this contributes to an image of migration that is a bit distorted, where we forget that most of migration globally is regular, is safe, is about family, it's about work. And instead, if we look at the movies, probably more than 80% of the movies today are about different forms of migration. And again, don't take me wrong, many of these movies really want to capture the nuance of migration and be perhaps more empathetic towards people who have to migrate irregularly or people who have to flee conflict. But one side effect of this very large production of movies that are about situations of danger and migration is that, again, we have a distorted view of what migration is at the global level, which is very clear. This is a poll by YouGov that came out a few months ago, which shows that most of the people in most countries in Europe think that the majority of migrants living in the country are living there irregularly, which, again, is not true, right? Most of the people who have a foreign passport and live in Italy or in the UK or in France are here with a regular permit to stay. Now, that's the first finding, if you want. The second finding is that most of the movies about migration have what I call a northbound bias. It seems that all the migration is towards the United States and towards Europe, which again is not true at the global level if we look at the data. And I think this is also a bit problematic because it leads people to think that this is this constant flow of people going to these regions and these countries, which is misleading once again. Now, this is, as I said, a very side project for me, a project where I had a lot of fun, and normally I noticed that people also are interested in movies. I hope that other people will pick up the database, give me suggestions on how to expand it, but also you're welcome to expand it yourself. I think there are a few ways in which this could be done. For example, by looking at the places where movies are produced, movies about migration, and also the ways in which movies are distributed. There is actually a boom nowadays of festivals that are about migration movies, and I think that's also an important avenue for circulation of the stories that we tell about migration. I encourage people to explore what the movies tell beyond the categories that I propose in this analysis. So, looking at stories of war, stories of love, stories of racism, exploitation. I think there is some value in there to even better understand how migration is narrated through cinema. And finally, but again, maybe you will have even additional ideas. I encourage other people to do a more visual analysis of movies. So what cinematographic techniques are used in these movies. Now, those are just some ideas. The summary of this presentation and the article that should come out in a few weeks based on this is that movies, I think, contribute to produce the way in which we think about migration, what I call the migration imaginaries that we have. Migration cinema is growing very fast, but it's very biased, and I presented two biases that I think are quite evident from this analysis. The focus on irregularity and forced displacement, and the predominance of North America and Europe as settings for movies. And I think this is a problem because it does obscure more regular, more ordinary, but really more mundane forms of human mobility in this world. To conclude, again, if you have any idea, but also suggestions, or if you have movies that you think are not in the database and should be, please send me an email. Special thanks to Luca, who enthusiastically helped me with this project, provided a lot of ideas. And finally, I will stop talking now, and I hope there are a few questions and comments, but I will leave open a survey, and I will circulate the results of the survey after this presentation. because I'm curious to hear from you which movie about migration really stick with you and contributed to the way in which you think about migration. You can fill in the survey through Slido by putting in this code. And I thank you again for your attention, and I will be silent now.
Thanks, Lorenzo. That was really interesting. And I know from having gone to a lot of seminars, I don't think we've had one explicitly about movies. So we're going to go to Q&A. So if you are online, you can either raise your hand or you can put a question in the chat. And but we'll start here in the room if people want to raise their hands if you have a question. Okay. Oh, lots of people. Okay. Wow. Okay, so we're going to take these first three right here. Eleonora, you don't know your name. And then you over there. We'll go online and then we'll go to Martin and over here. Okay, Eleonora, kick us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great presentation, very creative work as well. So I'm Eleonora. I'm a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center. I have a few questions just really out of curiosity. So the first one, I was really interested in so whether for you, or maybe this is for sort of further work, cinema is sort of shaping public images about migration, or rather reinforcing a specific way of portraying migrants, or really a specific view of migration as positive, as sort of threatening, or maybe in between. And I was really thinking that sort of looking at funding sources could be a very interesting spin-off for this project, because I have examples in mind. There's a debate in so public funding to cinema in Italy too. At the moment, not related to migration, but more generally about movies, about Italian personalities from the past. And so there are obviously cases where funding really determines the way a certain issue is sort of looked at. So you could even ask whether cinema in that case is simply reflecting the view that is out there, or rather suggesting, informing a certain view with maybe an agenda behind it. And secondly, obviously, I was also wondering if you had any impression of contestation about the portraying of migrants in these movies, either from other movies or from the debates around those movies. Obviously, one sort of risk, you don't classify movies by in sort of normative terms. But obviously, one sort of danger is stereotyping, stigmatizing, and so on. You mentioned The Godfather, and as part of the Sicilian diaspora, myself, that's the first question I get asked. Like, is The Godfather real? You know, what's like to grow up in Sicily, and so on. So obviously, there is contestation around, I'm sure, several of these movies on migration. So it would be interesting to know what's the debate around that, both in the art space but also in public terms. And that's it. Thank you. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, we're going to take a few and then let you respond. So you right next to Eleonora.
So congratulations for your very detailed work. You have talked about shaping identities and policies, that the movies shape identities and policies, and they are 80% empathetic towards the migrants or border crossers, let's say. But we see that in Europe, there is an 80% that believes that these people are irregular migrants. So my question is, do you think that these movies help in eliminating stereotypes? What is their effect? And who finances those movies? Did you search for that? Thank you. My name is Despina Anagnostopoulou. I'm from Greece.
Thank you, Nespia. And did you have a question back there? Yeah.
Hello, thanks, Lorenzo. That was a really interesting presentation. I love movies, so that's why I came today. I had a couple of questions around the, I guess, the selection of the movies. Just you explained well, and I haven't analyzed the data set, so perhaps it's there. But because in the title it spoke about migration, and then it was the spectacle of human mobility. So I also wondered if you're analyzing internal migration, because you then said border crossings and forced displacement, but that could happen and along the spectrum of like, I was thinking of all the movies and there's a lot, but like even something like Rabbit Proof Fence in Australia, which is obviously the displacement of people from one part of Australia to another, but this is replicated in a lot of movies. So I also wondered if that takes part in the analysis. And then also the element of permanence and like the temporal nature of it, because I think maybe there are more movies where we see like a flip of like north-south migration, but it's always seen as this temporary stop, or maybe like it's called for by a job or like a mission. But then I also wonder if that's counted. And then like still on the like selection, because obviously you mentioned sometimes like just typing in movies on migration or the kind of AI analysis, but if like the main theme of the movie is love or action, or like I'm thinking like, you know, Past Lives, which came out a while ago, and it's like, it's actually, you wouldn't necessarily, the first thing wouldn't come to mind as like, this is a movie about migration, but it's a love story or it's a story about war. And I wondered like if you're also, how many you can include, because migration obviously is the essence of society kind of thing. But I've got lots of other comments I can share after.
Yeah, take a stab.
Yeah, it's so cold, I'm freezing, but they say it keeps you sharp. So that's good. I'll try to answer very quickly. And thanks a lot for this question and comments. I don't think I'll be able to answer them all, but Eleonora, I think your first question, whether cinema shapes or reinforces imaginaries, that's a question really for movie directors and producers. I don't think I'm able to answer the question convincingly. But looking at the movies in this database, to me, it does seem that a lot of them, they try to shape. They don't just reproduce ideas that we have. They tend to present kind of an original or different view of migration. But again, I don't think I'm a good person to answer this question. Also, I never had the impression, apart from a few movies, that there is an agenda, a political agenda behind, with very few exceptions, perhaps. In both ways, some movies are blatantly depicting migration as a threat to communities, and some movies are also, I think, maybe a bit too positive on what migration might mean for an individual person or for a society. Second question, I just say yes, I think we should look at funding sources. This is not something I have done. I saw that someone online asked the same question. I encourage others to do it. To be honest, I wouldn't be entirely sure of where to start. And on the third question, in cases of contestation, this is also another way in which this work can be expanded. So to see the reaction of the audience, which I think would be extremely interesting. I think it would also be important to see how much movies circulated. So of course, some of the movies in the database reach very large audiences. Again, I made the example of One Battle After Another, which is a big production. And other movies are extremely powerful, but they're very small production, and very few people will see those movies. So that will also, I think, make a difference. So I guess I took your questions and threw them back at everyone as an encouragement to further develop these preliminary work and expand it in different ways. Despina, I think, thanks a lot for this question. So my colleague Lenka Drajanova here at the Migration Policy Center shows that it's very difficult to change individual opinions about migration, but one way in which you can try to do it is work on the impressionable years. So when people are young, And I think that's one way in which movies can be very powerful, because they're very often used in schools and in education settings, oftentimes to spark a debate about migration. So I think that's also one way in which they might have an effect. And again, many of us, we watch movies in our impressionable years, and that's why I think they stick with us. But for sure, we also have to be realistic. Again, another movie I mentioned, Io Capitano, that came out, I think, 2 years ago in Italy, but also in other countries. I guess it was watched mostly by people who already have a more nuanced view on migration, not by people who, have fairly, very strong opinions about what migration might mean for a place. So it's sometimes the limitation is that people who watch a movie might already be predisposed to the message of that movie. And Carol, who I think you also produced the movie on migration, which is not in the database because I don't think you went out in the cinemas, but perhaps one day it will. I think I do capture that. Of course, there are many issues with the selection of movies in this database and limitations, but maybe not the two that you mentioned. So I also include movies that are about internal migration, and that's one of the categories. Not many movies on this topic, but The Rabbit Proof Fence is part of the database, if I recall correctly. And so is Past Lives, which is a movie, as you say, about love, about longing. But the way I watched the movie, migration was also quite central. Of course, you point to something where it's a bit of a judgment call on my side, of course, how central migration is in a movie. I think in most of the movies in the database, it is quite central, beyond any doubt. You have movies where people in the movie migrate, but that's really a side aspect of the story. So I don't include them, but that's a bit, again, of a judgment call.
Thanks. Okay, let's go to some of our participants online. So we'll start with Irina and then go to Josiah Kaplan, and then I'll read a few of the questions from the comments. So Irina, if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, thank you for letting me ask the question. I'm a social psychologist, and my project was chosen for Jean Monnet Fellowship in Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. I hope to come in September. I was very impressed by your presentation and the topic you have chosen, the approach you have chosen to migration. And what lacked to me in your approach was job opportunities, topic of job opportunities for highly qualified forced migrants. I have also lived in Switzerland and worked at University of Lausanne, and I left Switzerland next day after the end of my contract, and I'm under temporary protection of France. And migration policies between Switzerland and France differ a lot. And most highly qualified migrants don't know hidden regulations. For example, in Switzerland, employers are not allowed to hire Ukrainians even if they want. While in France, Ukrainians under temporary protection of France are allowed to work in other countries. So I think that is extremely important to search this approach to job opportunities for highly qualified migrants through movies. And maybe even there can be some channel to show to contact producers and to make it possible to announce these regulations to migrants, because most highly qualified Ukrainians in Switzerland, professors and associate professors like me, even don't know that they don't have any job opportunities in Switzerland because they are citizens of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks. Josiah?
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And Lorenzo, this is a wonderful project. The only critique I'd have is that it makes me feel very lazy for the last time I was off sick. But I just wanted to suggest, because I think there's so much more to be played with in a data set that can also, as you say, grow. Three very quick reactions. One is I'd be really curious to see in a typology of analysis where migrant characters themselves are framed in the narrative as political subjects, as right-bearing agents, or as moral subjects, objects of compassion, just as a starting point. I'd be really curious as well to know how many films were directed, produced, and acted by migrants themselves or directors of migrant backgrounds. And I think that would open up a discussion space around how you evaluate the ethics of voice, who gets to narrate migration stories, and what are the consequences, who's being excluded. The third is that I think it'll be a really telling dichotomy to also consider films that frame the expat or expatriate lifestyle, which is typically set aside from refugee asylum or labor migration in terms of romantic, almost poetic terms. The ultimate stereotype here is Under the Tuscan Sun or Eat, Pray, Love. But I think it's really telling how privilege manifests in a public imagination of mobility. And I say that as somebody who is an immigrant who calls himself an expat. So just wanted to throw some ideas on the table, but I'd love to see this develop further. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you both. So Lorenzo, before I hand it over to you, I'll flag just a few of the questions from the comments of that other people have asked about knowing, have you looked or have you considered how movies are sold, like what their reach is, to kind of understand their impact. Also, whether you have any thoughts or research on how movies might impact public attitudes towards migration. And then this last one from Abibi, which I think is really interesting, about how kind of a shift from movies to real-time digital content, such as like videos shared by migrants themselves on platforms through TikTok or Facebook, or just that, like streaming services such as Netflix, we don't really go to the movies as much, how that will impact the role of cinema or the role of representation. Okay, over to you, and then we'll come back to the room.
Yeah, thanks again. And I should say it's also very nice to see many people I know online, Josiah, but I also spotted Emanuela and a few others. So thanks a lot for taking the time. And the comment on Irina, I think this is one classical aspect where, again, you're talking about something that is extremely consequential for the lives of people, but that many would see as, allow me for this term, more boring or a more mundane topic, which is why it doesn't become the object of migration movies, unfortunately. I should say in the database, I also capture documentaries, so not only narrative movies, but of course we can't control what's done. So I haven't found any documentary on this topic specifically. There are some documentaries on other aspects of migration that are very consequential for the lives of people in the database, but not on this one. I should say there are also very good examples of how some movies sometimes manage to bring to the attention of people these more technical, if you want, aspects. There are people in this room who work on citizenship specifically. An amazing movie in that regard is The Swiss Makers, that really shows and pokes fun at the naturalization process in Switzerland in the 70s. Josiah, 3 excellent comments and suggestions. I will let other people work on some of these. So it was, just too much for me to try and understand whether the directors or maybe the producers of movies or the screenplayers were migrants or not. That would be a huge work, very important, but I'm not sure how it could be done, to be honest, because we are really talking about hundreds, again, more than 500 movies already, and probably growing in the future. I do like a lot your comment on movies about expats. There are a few of them already. The one that I have in mind that I think those of my generation will know, I remember the title in French, which is L'Auberge Espagnole. I think in English is The Spanish Apartment. And it was really a movie about the first Erasmus generation in Europe. And you gave me the idea of expanding and adding one more theme to the coding, which is really, expats or this kind of migration, which is not there at the moment. So thanks a lot for that. And the comment on the importance of studying real-time digital content on the social media. Of course, I think that's also for someone else. I will just note that's something very important in shaping the way in which people understand the world. But I will note that very often for those very short video contents, there is extensive drawing on movies. So for example, I'm bombarded by reels or short clips on YouTube about finance, just because I have a side interest in finance, and migration. And a lot of those are drawn from movies about these topics. So again, I think movies are not completely useless, even in that sense, but someone else should look more carefully into, for sure, the circulation of short clips on online digital networks, social networks.
Thanks. Okay, coming back to the room, I know before Martin and Marina, you had your hand up. I don't know if anyone else wants to get in a comment, but this will be our last round.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I just have 2 comments building on some of the questions. These are just suggestions for what you might want to include in the first presentation of this. I mean, if you do a paper or something. So I would find it helpful to get a bit more information about how the movies were selected, because I'm still a little bit unclear about, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you think about The Sound of Music, which is basically set in Austria, and then in the final few minutes, the Van Trapp family escapes to Switzerland. Is that a migration movie? Does it qualify or not? Because, you know, just to make it more clear, you know, what are the precise criteria? When does the movie qualify as what you call a migration movie? Would be helpful. And then the second point is, I also would find it helpful to understand a bit better why certain movies are made, and what we know about the impact of movies in general, right? Because it goes back to the question that we had, that, I mean, we know that, I imagine, I'm not an expert, I imagine most movies are businesses, right? They want to sell. So they produce on topics which they know people want to hear about. So they're not going to present something very boring, mundane, everyday life. It has to be something else, right? But there might be space for other things. But just some information. I mean, there must be a huge literature on this. You know, why are movies made? To what extent do movies represent reality in general? Just forget about migration, just in general, you know. So just some context, even in the first presentation, I would find quite helpful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your really fascinating presentation, Lorenzo. I like it very much, as everything which concerns multidisciplinary studies, especially concerning culture. Actually, the majority of the questions have already been asked, and the only one which is left, I would like to find out if it is possible to distinguish between the periods depending upon the content of the narratives. For example, does something has something changed after the 2015, for example, in the content about the migrants? And yeah, so the timeline is really fascinating. You take a very long period. Is it possible to distinguish between the periods? And surely I'm excited about the movie, which is the most impressive. I mean, the results of this slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add on to that question, perhaps. I mean, you talked very clearly about this, you know, that recent migration films have this focus on borders and on undocumented, lack of documents, on displacement, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you see that over time? I mean, what were the main themes of the films in the earlier decades that you were researching? Is there sort of a real shift from diaspora films to these more kind of threat narrative, or trying to convince people away from the threat narrative idea? I was also interested, I mean, Bend It Like Beckham was also very much a film of my childhood, but I've never ever thought of that as a migration film. That's the first time I've sort of thought of it in that lens. So yeah, also interested a little bit in the kind of what counts. And if you see a sort of, what's your impression of the balance between sort of threat narrative films versus films that are trying to maybe start with a threat narrative, but then trying to convince people of the humanity, or trying to change people's perspective, or present a sort of more, humane picture of migration. Thanks so much.
Great, Lorenzo, I'll hand it over to you with my final comment or question. I know we've all just added like a lot of work you could do on a database. But I would be curious on kind of building on Martin's question of what counts as it, but actually more in the movies, who is the main character, since that is who drives how people respond to the film, whether they resonate, but who are those characters in the movie, specifically the main one? Because I think that would be a way to focus on what the story is and who is telling that.
There is a very beautiful thing in writing academic articles that at the end of the article, you set an agenda for future research. And there is an article coming out on this project again in a couple of weeks, but we will, I'm sure, be able to share it with you since you registered for this event. In that article, I lay out many of the questions that you just asked in that paragraph on future research agenda, probably for other people, not for me, in case you are interested in this, because for me, this has been and will continue to be a side project. So for sure, whether who is the main character in the movie, that's something that would be fascinating to know. I didn't even try in the database at the moment. To be quite honest, it would have been too much work. And I think the same for the question by Caitlin, even though I think I can answer the question anecdotally. Again, I haven't really done any analysis on this, but my impression is that clearly over time there were some shifts. So again, now there is a very strong focus on irregular migration and forced migration. In the 90s and early 2000s, there were many movies produced, again, globally, about diaspora and representation of communities abroad. And earlier in time, the majority of the movies, especially in the 70s and the 80s, were about what I call social inclusion, and other people call integration. Many movies about, for example, Italians living in Switzerland, but many different communities living in the United States, or people from former colonies living in France, and really representing these experiences. Again, anecdotally, most of the movies, to me, it seemed they try to take more the humanizing approach about migration. So they are relatively nuanced. Let's say there are very few movies that really represent migration as a threat for societies and communities. And going backwards, so Marina, I think your question is also part of, again, future research on this. But again, we see a lot of the movies about, for example, irregular migration after September 11 in the United States, when irregular migration also started to be associated with issues of security. And maybe some of the movies try to counter the kind of narrative, but still aware about these topics. So for sure, after some important events, and you mentioned 2015 in Europe, that also brings more movies about that specific topic and that specific theme. And finally, Martin, which is probably the hardest question in the sense that, again, I don't think I have a convincing answer to that question. On the selection of movie, one other thing I should say is that, again, I use the IMDb database, and then you can also filter in movies using some tags. So I included movies that have, as example of tags, I used migration or immigration, diaspora, again, forced displacement, forced migration. Those are the tags that I used. I don't think it answers your question entirely, but I guess this part of the answer is these are movies that are considered to be about migration also by general databases of movies that exist. Once again, because that was also what I was answering to Carol, I don't think there is ever a definitive answer or the possibility to differentiate between movies that really are about migration and movies where migration happens, but it's really in the background and it's not very relevant for analysis. And your other question on why movies are made and what is the impact, again, and I know it's very unsatisfactory of me, but I would answer as I did to Eleonora. I think for that, we really would need to interview movie makers and movie producers. And there are other people who do it, not for migration studies, of course, but I think they are much better qualified to answer the question than I ever will myself. yeah, and thanks again for all these comments. And I also saw many comments and suggestions online already. So I booked a day of this week to expand the database and try to think about your suggestions.
Great. Well, Lorenzo, thank you so much for sharing, for capitalizing on your sick time in a really productive way. I think we all now feel a bit of shame how we spend our sick time. Thank you to everyone who is able to come and join us in person and everyone who is able to join us online. Our seminars are posted on our YouTube channel, and the best way to stay connected to the Migration Policy Center is to follow us on LinkedIn or to sign up for our newsletter, where you will hear like things when Lorenzo's paper is published. And we will also work to make sure that the database is findable online. If you want to post something about how you found the webinar, what you learned, we would love to see it. And we'll see you all for the next seminar.